Good evening. This is the second in the last of our um, uh, 10 greatest hits in Bible stories, in in my humble opinion. Um, we did a little bit of rearranging along the way, but just to refresh your memories on this um, best best 10 or most important. That's how I tried to um, vet these, what were most important to us. And the first one was the resurrection of Jesus. The second was the crucifixion of Jesus. And we noted in both of those that the two are so closely connected to each other that you can hardly separate those into two different stories. It's one event. The third on my list was the incarnation, just the notion that God, the creator of heaven and earth, became part of creation in the person of Jesus. Um, uh, then then we um, then we identified the call to Abraham and Sarah. It's what gets the whole story of salvation, of call and response of salvation going in the Old Testament, and then it's the basis. It's kind of the assumption that the New Testament has in its background. Um, Similarly, the next most important was the Exodus. It was the event during which the Israelites became the Israelites, moving into the land that had been promised to their ancestors so many generations prior to that. Remember the three-part promise that to Abraham and Sarah and to their descendants, that they would become a great nation, that they would have a land of their own, and that through them all the nations of the world would be blessed or would receive a blessing. And in the Exodus story, we see that the people are now a great nation. The descendants of Abraham and Sarah have become not a nation as in a structure with the Constitution, but a large group of people. Tribe is maybe another way of thinking of it. Um, and so they are the great people. They're on their way to the promised land, to this land promised to their ancestors. And on the way, they receive the law from God by way of Moses. And again, for um, for a Jewish understanding, that giving of God's law, God's will, God's teaching, that is the thing that has the potential to bless all people. That's that blessing. For Christians, we understand it to be that Jesus came through the Jewish people, through the Israelites, that through them the world receives the Savior. So that's two different kind of concepts in some tension between Judaism and Christianity, obviously. The next one we identified was the sacrament of the Lord's, again, sorry, I identified the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, in which there is, we understand, something absolutely transcendent that happens because God says it happens, and we we believe it. We buy into this promise that when we gather together and break bread and share a cup, that somehow in some way that we can't even begin to understand, God is present with us. That incarnation, that enfleshment takes place again. Let's see. Then we 2 weeks ago looked at the empire, the 100-year empire of King David and King Solomon, where the Israelites had by that time conquered the land that God had promised to Abraham and Sarah. They took possession of the land. They made a respectable little empire there in and around Jerusalem, and for almost 100 years, this house of David was a significant player in the ancient Mideast. When Solomon died, tensions that had been in the family and among the military when Solomon was there, they erupted and there was a civil war. And after that, as I was talking about on Sunday, there were two Israelite kingdoms. The northern kingdom took the name Israel, and the southern kingdom took the name Judah. They were rivals. They fought each other. They ganged up with people around them to attack each other. I mean, it was a bad blood between or among the two different gatherings or confederations of the Israelite, or later the Jewish people. As a result of the breakdown of the kingdom, outside forces come in and first destroy the northern kingdom completely. That's the Assyrian army, destroys the northern kingdom, and it's never heard from again. They disperse the inhabitants all over creation. In 587 BC, the Babylonians come in and they conquer the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, that has Jerusalem as its center. And they take, unlike the Assyrians, who just took the prisoners and scattered them all over the empire so that they couldn't have any kind of uprising again, the Babylonians took the kind of the leadership of then Israel, Judah, the court, the temple, and so on, took them into Babylon and made them servants of the Babylonian emperor. And the Babylonians, in that way, gained the knowledge and competence of the Jewish leaders. And during the time that the Babylonians were in charge, Jewish leaders kind of became part of the civil service and rose up in the ranks. It's a wonderful set of stories. And then just to finish out this exile, then the Persian Empire came in and overran and took over from the Babylonian Empire. And the Persians allowed these folks who had been in Babylon for a generation, or their descendants, allowed them to return to Jerusalem and establish a Jewish homeland again in Jerusalem, in and around Jerusalem. And the Persian emperors were kind of the patrons of that. They said, as long we'll help you rebuild Jerusalem as long as you recognize that we're your overlord. And the Jewish leaders agreed to that and went back to uh, what we now call Israel and Palestine, went back there and began the process of rebuilding their country, their city, and that goes on for several hundred years, slowly, and it's frustrating. And there's wonderful stories in the Bible about the frustration that the people are having because the walls are taking so long to build, and everybody knows that no matter how high they build these walls, it's 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 kind of symbolic because they're just trying to rebuild the old walls. It's kind of symbolic because the Persians have enough firepower and army to come in and occupy them, you know, surround them anytime they wanted to. So they're not really building any actual defense for themselves. They're just rebuilding something that they once felt um, gave them defense. I'm going to stop there for a second, see if anybody has questions. So that's that's basically that's where the Old Testament, as we know it, that's where the Old Testament ends, with the rebuilding, but slow, frustrating rebuilding of Jerusalem after the return from exile. Um, about 100 or 150 years after they started rebuilding, the Greek the Greek army under Alexander the Great moved down from his father was Philip of Macedon. It was the northern part of what today is Greece. And what Philip of Macedon did, and then his son Alexander the Great continued, was just move from the north of Greece throughout Greece and just conquered. And then went across I'm not sure what, it might be the Aegean, over to what now is Turkey, what they used to call Asia Minor, and then just continued down the coast to what's now Lebanon, to what's now Jerusalem and Israel and Palestine, and all the way down to Egypt, and just conquered all of that area, including going east and conquering Persia. So then the Greeks were in control of what we think of as the Holy Land for a couple of hundred years. And then just about a little bit less than 100 years before Jesus was born, the Romans beat the Greeks, and they took over that whole empire that now also included Italy and was starting to go west toward France and Spain and so on. So that's kind of the situation at the time Jesus was born. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
So it seems like this region has it been in constant conflict for thousands of years.
You're exactly right, and it's and part of the reason is that it is at a absolute crossroads between there have for millennia there have been civilizations that have risen and fallen, but there have been three areas in the Mediterranean area that were particularly fertile for the development of civilization, and one of those was what we call Asia, what we call Turkey now, what was Asia Minor. There were just a succession of strong um, city-states. The Trojan Wars go back to that they predate the Bible, predate the New Testament, but they tell the story of these people in Turkey and in Greece and their wars, and then their dispersion of themselves, either the winners or exile of the losers to other parts of the empire. Um, when um, when Julius Caesar, when the Romans conquered or beat the Greeks and the Romans took over, and we talked about this some last week. When the Romans took over, they correctly understood themselves to be a less civilized, less culturally developed civilization than the Greeks that they had just conquered. And they spent about the first 100 years after they conquered Greece trying to make themselves as Greek-like as possible. And it's their art, their sculpture, their painting, their writing, all of it is just kind of an attempt to show that we can do what Greece did. And eventually the Roman civilization kind of engulfs the Hellenistic or the Greek civilization and digests it and then takes it into its own directions. And Rome becomes even greater than Greece was. Any other questions? So the story that I picked for the second to the second of the last of these 10 is the story of conversion of Saint Paul. And I'm hoping that a couple of you can open your Bibles and be ready to read. I'm going to give you a couple of passages. One is Acts 22, verse 3. It might be a couple of verses before that. The other is, let's see, 1 Corinthians 15:9. And the last one is Acts 9, chapter 9 of Acts. So why is the conversion of Paul, in my opinion, one of the most important stories in the Bible? Paul, you will probably remember, is the earliest Christian writing that we know of. Paul's Paul's earliest writings are from around 50 AD to, for the next 12, maybe as much as 15 years. It's Paul's writings, for the most part, are written earlier than any of the Gospels. So we start the New Testament with the Gospels, the stories about Jesus. But the reality is that the letters of Paul and the writings of Paul were just being disseminated and distributed in the church almost a generation before the Gospels were written. And in many, many, many ways, we can see how Paul shaped how the gospel writers presented Jesus. Again, Paul comes first. The gospel writers may have had some familiarity with some of Paul's writings. Let's back up just a bit and kind of go back to who is Paul. Who has the Acts 22:3? Anybody?
I can do it.
I have it
Okay.
here too. Either way.
All right, go, Mike.
You sure?
Yeah.
So 22, verse 3.
Yeah.
Okay. I am a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the first of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way up to the point of death by binding both men and women and putting them in prison, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. From them, I also received letters to the brothers in Damascus, and I went there in order to bind those who were there and bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. While I was on my way and approaching Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone about me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I answered, Who are you, Lord? Then he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I asked, What am I to do, Lord? The Lord said to me, Get up and go to Damascus. There you will be told everything that has been assigned to you to do. Since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, those who were with me took my hand and led me to Damascus. A certain Ananias, who was
Ananias.
a certain
That's okay.
Ananias, who was a devout man according to the law and well spoken by all the Jews living there, came to me, and standing beside me, he said, Brother Saul, regain your sight. In that very hour I regained my sight and saw him. Then he said, The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear his own voice. For you will be his witness to all the world of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you delay? Get up, be baptized, and have your sins washed away, calling on his name. After I had returned to Jerusalem, and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw Jesus saying to me, Hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And while the blood of your witness Stephen was shed, I myself was standing by, approving and keeping the coats of those who killed him. Then he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Up to this point, they listened to him, but then they shouted, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. And while they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, the tribune directed that he was to be brought into the barracks and ordered him to be examined by flogging to find out the reason for this outcry against him.
That's the way to get information.
Yeah, that's one way.
Go ahead.
But when they had tied him up with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who is uncondemned? When the centurion heard that, he went to the tribune and said to him, What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen. The tribune came and asked Paul, Tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, Yes. The tribune answered, It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship, Paul said, but I was born a citizen. Immediately those who were about to examine him drew back from him, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. Since he wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and the entire council to meet. He brought Paul down and had him stand before them. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, Brothers, up to this day, I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God. Then the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. At this, Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, and yet violation of the law you order me to be struck? Those standing nearby said, Do you dare to insult God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not realize, brothers, that he was a high priest, for it is written, You shall not speak evil of a leader of your people. When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees.
Sadducees and Pharisees.
Sadducees.
That's just not a political, but a religious group within the Jewish council.
When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And an assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there was no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees group stood up and contended. We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit of an angel has spoken to him? When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him into the barracks. That night, the Lord stood near him and said, Keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, you must bear witness also in Rome. In the morning, the Jews joined in a conspiracy and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who joined in this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the council must notify the tribune to bring him down to you on the pretext that you want to make a more thorough examination of his case, and we are ready to do away with him before he arrives. Now, the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush, so he went and gained an entrance to the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to report to him." So he took him, brought him to the tribune, and said, "Prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you." The tribune took him by the hand, drew him aside privately, and asked, "What is it that you have to report to me?" He answered, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more thoroughly into his case. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of the men are lying in ambush for him. They have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they kill him. They are ready now and are waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, ordering him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of this." Then he summoned two of the centurions and said, "Get ready to leave by 9 o'clock tonight for Caesarea,
Caesarea, Caesarea.
with 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Also, provide mounts for Paul to ride and take him safely to Felix the governor." He wrote a letter to this effect. Claudius Lysis, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. But when I learned that he was a Roman citizen, I came to the guard and rescued him. Since I wanted to know the charge for which they accused him, I had him brought to their council. I found that he was accused of concerning questions of their law, but was charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there was a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him during the night to Antipatus.
Antipatus.
The next day, they let the horsemen go on with him, while they returned to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor. They presented Paul before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he belonged to, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia. Okay.
That one.
I can't get it right.
That's all right.
He said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." Then he ordered that he be kept under guard in Herod's quarters. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and an attorney, a certain Tertullius, and they reported that their case against Paul to the governor. When Paul had been summoned, Tertullius began to accuse him, saying, "Your Excellency, because of you, we have long enjoyed peace and reforms that have been made for this people because of your foresight. We welcome this in every way and everywhere with utmost gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you to hear us briefly with your customary graciousness. We have, in fact, bound this man, a pestilent fellow, an agitator among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and so we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn from him concerning everything of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the charge by asserting that all this was true. When the governor motioned to him to speak, Paul replied, I cheerfully make my defense, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation. As you can find out, it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They did not find me disputing with anyone in the temple or stirring up a crowd either in the synagogues or throughout the city. Neither can they prove to you the charge that they now bring against me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors, believing everything laid down according to the law or written in the prophets. I have a hope in God, a hope that they themselves also accept, and that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Therefore, I do my best always to have a clear conscience toward God and all people. Now, after some years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to offer sacrifices. While I was doing this, they found me in the temple, completing the rite of purification without any crowd or disturbance. But there were some Jews from Asia. They ought to be here before you to make an accusation if they have anything against me. Or let these men here tell you what crime they have found when I stood before the council, unless it was this one sentence that I called out when standing before them. It is about the resurrection of the dead, and that I am on trial before you today. But Felix, who was rather well informed about the way, adjourned the hearing with the comment, when Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case. Then he ordered the centurion to keep him in custody, but to let him have some liberty and not prevent any of his friends from taking care of his needs. Some days later, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him speak concerning the faith of Christ Jesus. As he discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became frightened and said, go away for the present. When you have an opportunity, I will send for you. At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. For that reason, he used to send for him very often and converse with him. After 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and since he wanted to grant the Jewish a favor, Felix left Paul in prison.
Let's stop there. That's a very detailed retelling by Luke, the author of Acts. The author of Luke is also the author of Acts. Remember, this is Luke is writing somewhere around 70 or so AD. So this is a generation since the stories that he's narrating took place. But they are very much similar to in Paul's own writings. He tells essentially the same story. And it is that while interesting, he doesn't come from Jerusalem or Judea or that area at all. He comes from Tarsus in Cilicia, which is nowadays it's Eastern Turkey. So it's some distance away, but it was by that time it was, there were many prosperous towns around the growing Roman Empire. Many of them were left over from the Greeks. They had been built up and so on by the Greeks, and the Romans inherited them. Tarsus was one of these very cosmopolitan cities, and it already during the lifetime of Jesus, it already had a large Jewish population. As a matter of fact, one of the things that's very remarkable about Paul is Paul, we believe, lived about the same time as Jesus. May have been a contemporary. There's no indication whatsoever that Paul ever saw Jesus during Jesus' earthly life. But Paul begins the story by saying he was raised to be a zealous Jew. He studied under one of the great rabbis, Gamaliel, and he really claims that pedigree, but it also he is a Roman Empire. Most of the Jews, Roman citizen, most of the Jews were not Roman citizens, but it was granted by birth to other parts of the empire, and Paul was a Roman citizen by birth. In that story that Mike just read, when the Jews are trying to kill him, and they even flog him, he makes the appeal that he is a Roman citizen and they have no jurisdiction over him. And in fact, they have just flogged a Roman citizen without authority, and they can be arrested for that, for abusing a Roman citizen. Anyway, that appeal goes to the governor in Caesarea. Caesarea is a huge harbor. It's just a masterpiece. It still exists. The ruins of it still exist. It's this Roman. They built a harbor pretty much from scratch. They just saw a good place that had no harbor, and they built a artificial harbor out into the Mediterranean. And you can still see today you can still see the remnants of that. But then they built a magnificent city all around that. And Caesarea, it's named after Caesar. They knew how to make friends. So, but the fact that Paul starts out a zealous opponent of Christianity, he gets a job finding and being authorized to arrest Christians and bring them in chains to Jerusalem, where they can be dealt with by the Roman authorities. And it's on one of those trips to Damascus that he has letters to go arrest Christians in Damascus. Damascus is in, it's where Damascus, Syria is, a little east of this area of what we think of as the Holy Land. So he's on his way to Damascus and has this miraculous experience of Jesus talking with him. he has a vision of Jesus. He hears Jesus telling him, "Stop persecuting me," and says that instead I'm going to make you, essentially says, I'm going to make you the greatest apostle ever. And Saul's name is changed to Paul. Saul is a Hebrew name. Paul is a Roman name. His name is changed to Paul, and he gets to Damascus. He gets blessed by Ananias, who's a leader apparently of the Christians there, the ones that Paul was out to go get. And he has had this conversion experience. He stays there for a few days, kind of recovers, and then goes quickly to Jerusalem. And he tells this story a little bit later. He didn't go to Jerusalem and confer with the other apostles who were still kind of centered in Jerusalem. Instead, he went directly into foreign regions, what the Jews called Gentile. Anything that wasn't Jews were Gentile. They also referred to them as heathen, but it's the Gentiles, the non-Jews, that Paul's particular call was to proclaim the good news to Gentiles. And a few years into his ministry, where he's going to all through the eastern part of the empire, he's going to these big cities that have synagogues because of the diaspora of the Jewish people all over the Mediterranean. There are synagogues in every city. He goes to the synagogues, and he basically he basically presents his bona fides, that is his credentials as a certified Pharisee, educated by one of the greats, Gamaliel. And he says, I know what I'm talking about when I talk about the story that is part of our heritage. I also know what I'm talking about when I tell you that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah that we have always hoped for. And that was his story. Every time he would go into a new place, he would go to the synagogue, kind of establish his credentials, and then tell them that Jesus is the answer to the question that is kind of laid, that's unanswered at the end of the Hebrew scriptures. How is God going to redeem God's people? A narrow understanding would be that the idea was that God would redeem the Jewish people and somehow reestablish them in their glory, like in the days of David and Solomon. But what what Paul and the church that followed him said is that in the death and resurrection of Jesus, God was reconciling or saving not just the Jewish people, but all people, and that this message of God's love and forgiveness and acceptance is a message for all people, and it is the gift that was promised to Abraham and Sarah and their people, that this gift is coming by way of this the Jewish people or the Hebrew people or the Israelite people, however you want to name it. Let me stop there, see if you have any questions, anything that you didn't understand. Again, Paul kind of develops a Christian theology earlier than the gospel writers, and the gospel writers are in some ways indebted to the thoughts that Paul that Paul shared with the church. What Paul typically did was, when let's say he went to the town of Corinth and went to the synagogue there, they essentially kicked him out, but maybe a few of the Jews from that synagogue were converted, and then Paul would tell other people, the Gentiles, the same good news, that this was for all people, and they would become Christians, and there would be established a small Christian community in Corinth. And Paul might stay with that church for a year or so. He was always very careful when he went into a town on his missionary work. He would essentially set up a tent and become a tradesman, a leather worker, I think he was, and paid for his own expenses while he stayed in that town, because he didn't want to burden anybody that he was trying to convince of this message about Jesus. He didn't want to burden them with having to take care of him. So you may have, or I guess it was a tent maker that he was. You may have heard the term in the church, even in the last 50 years, a tent maker ministry, and that typically refers to a pastor who is who has a secular job, like part-time or even full-time, and then is called to a congregation that can't really afford to pay a full salary and benefits or something like that. So there's an understanding that this person is going to pay their own way and serve the congregation. That's a tent maker ministry, modeled after Paul. So Paul does this, goes all over the northern and eastern part of the Roman Empire, visits and starts congregations in each of these big cities, and then he doesn't just start them and abandon them. He starts them. He develops indigenous leadership, trains a cadre of people to continue to oversee the ministry in the church, and then he continues to be connected to the church by way of letters. And we have evidence in one case, and that's in the letter 2 Corinthians. It is fairly clear that the book that we now call 2 Corinthians was actually a combination of about 4 separate letters that were written, and it was correspondence. The people in Corinth would write to Paul wherever he was, and they kept up with his itinerary somehow. They would write to Paul and say, we have this kind of dispute, we have this thing going on in our congregation. You're our father. What do you think we should do about it? And Paul would write back. And again, we think that 2 Corinthians is actually 3 of those pretty individual. I mean, it's not individual like it's written to Joe. It's written to the people of God in Corinth to help them resolve in what Paul understands as a Christian manner some dispute that's going on in the church. Fairly early in Paul's ministry, he runs across Peter in their travels. And Peter is only going to synagogues and only talking to Jewish people and trying to convert Jewish people to Christianity. And his line is that the Jewish Messiah has arrived. Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, and we Jews now, we need to accept that and accept the triumph that God has sent the Messiah. But he didn't have any kind of Peter didn't have any kind of message for Gentiles. And Peter and Paul cross paths, and Peter hears that Paul is preaching that Jesus is the Messiah for all people and taking the gospel to the Gentiles. And there's a little hissing that goes on between those two great apostles. And what ends up happening is they agree to take the dispute to the Council of Elders that is still in Jerusalem, and perhaps includes Mary, the mother of Jesus, at least in the community, if not among the elders. But it's led by James, who appears to be a brother of Jesus. We don't know anything more other than that he's described as the brother of Jesus. They have what we call the First Church Council in Jerusalem. They gather all the elders. Peter gives his side. It's not Peter, it's representatives of each give their arguments for why this is the Messiah for the Jewish people, and Paul gives their argument for and for the Peter side of it. They weren't saying that Gentiles couldn't become part of this new messianic kingdom, but they had to convert to Judaism first so that they could benefit from the Jewish Messiah. And Paul was saying, no, you don't need to become Jewish first. You can go straight from whatever your current religion is to recognizing Jesus as the Messiah or the Savior for all people, Jesus as the Son of God and the Savior for all people. And they hash it out in Jerusalem, and they come to a conclusion that that Paul is right, but that Peter is a little bit right. It's advisable for people who become Christians from other traditions to still keep some kosher laws. That eventually disappears, but it's kind of a compromise. But it is the essentially the ratification of the of Paul's notion that the death and resurrection of Jesus was, the word is salvific. It provides salvation for all people. In Christianity, then, and we're a little over our time, we'll finish here. In Christianity, then, what we have done for 2,000 years is said, when Paul says all people, who does he have in mind? Because, and this is in parentheses, certainly those kind of people aren't eligible, or those kind of people that you have to somehow conform yourself to some kind of narrow expectation to qualify for this grace. And Paul's major thrust is no, you don't qualify. Nobody qualifies for it. It's grace because it's God's gift. And it's God's gift to everyone. Let's stop there. Next week is going to be the vision of Saint Peter. It's recorded by Luke in Acts chapter 10. It has a very, very similar flavor or theme to this conversion of Paul and the outreach to the Gentiles. And this is just kind of a different, a story of Peter coming to the same realization. Wonderful story. We'll take that up next week. Any questions? Just FYI, we're going to take the month of August and the first week of September off from Wednesday night Bible study, and then start up again right after Rally Day. So next week will be the last till after Rally Day. Thanks, everybody.